So welcome to part 5 of this Flask series, and we are finally getting to that point where everything's going to come together. We're going to connect the, like it says, part 2 of 2, so we're going to connect the front end and the back end, and it's all going to work, and we're going to have this beautiful functional website. And remember, this is just the beginning. This is just looking at, hopefully this was a very useful and simple way to get started with Flask. You can then do many, many more things. So this is really just a list of 8 things that we're going to be doing in this order, so you can pause the screen or come back to it, and this is just really a helpful sort of note. But basically we're going to be putting all the necessary commands which are to do with the database on the main.py file. We're going to be making a couple of routes which are concerned with the insert comment bit, which is going to be using a get and post request, so that it can be stored in the database, and obviously then we're going to be putting it all together by putting the right commands on the HTML. Now this word Fullstack is an interesting one. Let's have a quick look on Google. Just think of the first job site that comes to mind, say read, and let me type in Fullstack. So Fullstack is really a term that you should, let me type in temporary contract, if you're a student or you're looking for the potential of this sort of thing. Let's type in part-time even. You can see that all of these jobs are actually looking for full stack. I typed in the wrong thing, did I? Full stack. Full stack engineers. Now I just had something else up earlier, so if you look at Django developers, Python developers, you can see that they're looking for experience in Flask and Django. Sometimes a job will specify that they want a back-end Python engineer, but most often most companies, or what you would require for yourself, even if you were starting your own business or your own website, is a full stack, which refers to having the front end knowledge, things like JavaScript, HTML and CSS, and the back end. In a language like Java, JavaScript can be a back-end server-side language, or Python or PHP. So in this case, Python. So let's get started, and we're going to begin by putting the necessary commands on the big questions.py file. So let's open that by double-clicking it and have a look. So one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to add right underneath here, just above where it says app.flask, I'm going to import and type it, make sure it's not 2 this time, import SQLite 3. That's going to make sure that this .py file also has a reference to the SQLite database that we are using. But of course we also want to tell it what database we are referring to. So let's put all the same information. You can just copy and paste it. I'm just going to quickly type it. I think it was called, what was the name of the variable, DB locale, and the name of the database was usersdb, and that should be pretty much it. So that line and that line, we've set it up. We now need to actually go down somewhere here. I could do it anywhere. Let's do it down the bottom. We have to actually set up the add comments route. And I think I had actually done one. Yep, there it is. So we need to actually set this up such that it works correctly. Because remember, this is doing something much more complex. It's not just rendering an HTML page. It's actually doing, it's actually taking data, it's retrieving data, and it's putting data into a website. So add comments. So here, at this URL here for add comments, just after the route or the root, I'm going to add a comma and put in something that you might have heard of, you might not have heard of, but I'm going to refer to these 2 methods which are called get, so you're going to be in capital, and post. Now if you think about these intuitively, it should be pretty obvious what they're doing. This is referring to getting information. So you log into a website, you see the table, you're getting that information. But post, it's like putting something into a post box. It's referring to inserting into. So these are the two methods. These are the two things you could do, as it were, and we need to set this add comments method up to be either one. So we've got the get and the post. Now, under here, we're going to actually use an if statement. So think about what this means as I type it. If request method. So we have an option of two different methods. We have either get, which means to get information, to retrieve it, or post, which is to put something into the database. And remember, we're referring to this add comments form or page where a user puts information into the form. So if the request method is equal to get, now this is all Pythonic. I'm going to do a little bit on Python functions and how they return values and a few things at some point, but just copy it as is for now. So if the request method is get, in other words, you're not posting anything into the database, make sure you have your inverted commas and you have a colon after that, well then you just want to return and render, and think about it, which template do you want to render? You just want to render the add comment. It's called add comments, isn't it? So add comments.html page. Always check. I just took a moment to look over there to make sure that was the name of the HTML page that I wish to render. So if you're not really posting anything, you just want to go back to the add comments page. In other words, stay where you are and do nothing. But else, and remember the if and the else need to be on the same indentation level, and everything inside the if statement needs to be indented. And after the else, we indent. Now, Sublime Text does this for you, but you do need to get used to the fact that in Python, indentation means something. So if request method is equal to get, just stay on the same page, don't do anything particular. But otherwise, now this is where the interesting bit comes in, we need to actually set up all the different fields that are going to be posted, and we need to somehow store them. We need to store the results of what's going to be entered in the form, in some sort of variable. So let's set up a variable. What could we call it? Call it comments or user details or something. And again, it's going to be a tuple. There are different ways of doing this. I'm picking the simplest. So then we're going to say, we're going to request from the form to get the results of the name. Now remember, on the form, on the home page, next to the ID, we had a name. This is what it's referring to. So it's very important that that's been set up correctly. So we're going to get the name. What else do we need to get? We need to get a request form title, and actually the first thing they get is the title, so let's get that in the right order. Then we get finally the comments. We don't need a comma at the end. And I'm just struggling to remember, is it comments or comment? It's very important that, again, you get that right. So we're not referring to that page, we're referring to the actual field in the database. I've called it comments there. I think it is comments anyway, so it will generate an error if I've made a mistake. So we have comments. Now down here, that's the end of your tuple. Let's explain what's happening. So user details is basically a variable which is now going to store all the information from these fields. It's requesting this information from these fields if a post method is what's happening. Now you notice this little command called request. We need to actually import it up here, otherwise nothing's going to work. So right at the top, request. Just add that in, and quite an important thing. So now that we've got this user details, we've sort of isolated it from the form, we've held it in a variable. Think of a variable like a storage box, so the variable is user details. What do we want to do with it? So think intuitively. You want to take user details, and of course you want to insert it into the database or into your table comments. So I need to make another function. don't I? So down here, I'm going to now make another function, and this time let's call it something which makes sense. I want to just insert these comments, these user details. Let's call it insert comment for now, and let's just pass that. Okay, so here, this is the function in which I am getting or retrieving all the input data into the fields and into this variable user details. I now wish to pass the variable user details into this function which I've just made, which is called insert comment. So I'm going to go insert comment, and I am going to make sure it's on the check for you the indentation level, same level as the else. Yep. And I'm going to pass, that's how we refer to it in programming, pass this variable to this function. So now this little function, insert comment, can see the user details that you've just passed it. Now, in this function, we need to produce, again, just pause the screen and think about what you think we need to do, but we need to produce kind of the opposite. We're not posting something. Well, we are posting something, but first we need to actually retrieve it, right? So let's start to create this. First, we need the usual. You can just go back to your query and copy it. I'm going to try and be really accurate and do the usual. So db locale, you set up your Connie cursor so you can use some commands there. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to set up what's called an SQL execute string. This could be called anything. Again, it's just a variable which is going to store the results of an SQL statement, which is going to insert user details in a specific way, in a format that we specify into the table comments. So I'm going to write, again, you can just get this from W3 Schools, but I'm just going to write the SQL, which is just going to be as simple as insert into comments, which is, this is the name of the table in your database. Insert into comments the different fields, which are title, name, and comment. Was it comment or comments? I'm going to get some sort of error here. So let's just take a minute to go back to the create. You can see it's comment. Great. Okay, so comment. Title, name, and comment. And the usual syntax, you have values. But this time, I'm not going to actually put in the values. I'm going to put in placeholders by using these question marks. Okay, and at the end, I do that with a single speech mark and semicolon. Right, now, I need to execute this in exactly the same way that we were doing this in these files. You know how you execute, you say C execute, and you execute a command. All I'm doing, nothing sinister here, but really what I'm doing is, instead of typing that into the execute, I'm going to use this variable now and put that into this execute command, and it will do the same thing. It will execute this command. So I'm going to now type in c.execute and then put in that variable that I've just created, which is storing in it the command, the SQL command to insert into. So SQL, and I'm going to pass it here as well, the user details. Okay. Of course, don't forget connie.commit, which is going to commit this information that you've just, all the stuff that you've done, to the database, and don't forget connie.close. Now, for our sakes, we could also type something like print user details, just to show that this is happening. It will print it in the server, in the command prompt in the console, so we can do some testing with that later. So anyway, we've set up now the add comments route, and we've also set up the insert comments function here, which is awesome. So what we've done is we've set up two routes, one for add comments, which is to do with this get and the post method, and also one for insert comment, which is actually taking the data which is generated from this root over here and putting it into this one. So we could at this point actually deal with this, and we could look on the add comments.html page and say how are they linked? Where do we put these methods? How can they be acknowledged on the HTML page? But I'm going to follow the set method, the steps that I outlined for myself on the PowerPoint. So for now, let's just go on and let's make the next function, which is going to be a query. Now, of course, once a user has inserted a comment, what do we want to happen with that comment? We don't want it to just be stored in the database. We want it to be displayed back on the home page for everyone to see. So in order for that to happen, we need to actually query the database, get all the information from the database, and then put it into a variable so that we can play with that data and we can display it and do stuff with it. So let's create another function. Let's call it query the comments table. You can call it anything you like, something that makes sense to you. And let's do the same things again. I really should be copying and pasting this, but it's good fun to type it because it does help you remember. So Connie SQLite db locale Connie.cursor, which remember sets up our thing for the commands, and here I would like to set up a little space. This time we're going to have our triple speech marks again. For a command. Now remember what I said, we're querying the database here, we just want everything that is in the database. So you should, from setting up the previous query, which was db query, you should be able to just refer to that really, or you can look up W3 scores, or you might just remember, if you're a genius, that the command is select star, which is select all from comments. And that's going to get all the data from the database, including these user details, which have hopefully, if it's worked, been inserted into the database. So once we've done that, of course, we want to be able to work with this data. So let's call it user data. Again, that's just a variable. It can be called anything you like. And I would like to fetch all, use that command on it. And now I'd like to return user data. Oops, and call it, if you called it user underscore data, call it the same thing. Let's make sure I get that right. So user data. Right, so what this function is doing is, it's obviously it's a Python function. It is not, this is an important distinction, it's not printing the user data. It's not printing it to the screen, it's just returning it. And it might be necessary for me to demonstrate this, so let me show you this quickly. If I opened up a blank Python file, right? Now I could create a little function which says, really too small. I don't know if you can see that. Should we just configure the IDE to make it slightly bigger? You don't feel saddened by the size of it. That should be okay. Right. So I'm going to create a function which says do something. Return something. Return the number. Right. Return a number. And this function is going to have two variables, and actually it's just going to add these variables together, and it's going to print Z. Now what this does, if I call this function return a number, I really should have picked something simpler, and I say run, I have to save it now, I'll just save it there, test. It prints 6, which is great. So what it does is it takes 3 and 3 and 6 and it prints 6. But I could also just say return 6, or return the value of Z, which is this variable here. Now if I run the program, you'll see that it doesn't actually do anything, because what's happening is it's returning the value of Z, which is a variable which is holding the value 6, but it's just holding that value in that variable without doing anything. But you could then pass that value and you could do things with it in another function, as we're going to do with the result of our query comments function. So whether that's helped you or not, I'm not sure, but basically we have this function called query comments, and it's returning a value that we've arbitrarily decided to call user data, which is storing all the results in the database so far. So the next step, of course, is to think about what do we do with this user data. Of course, we want to take this and we want to display it on the home page. And there's a couple of things now that we need to do to really make sure that everything on the HTML side, which is the front end, is tied up with the back end and all these queries that we're writing. So let's start by opening up the home page and actually the add comments page. And you remember we, in a previous, I think, video, we added these names and the IDs. These need to be correct, otherwise nothing's going to work. So we can, if we get an error, we can come back to that. It's very important that these match up. And another thing that we do need to do is tie up, if I go to add comments and we look at this form. Now this form has to be either one of the methods that we specified up here in the add comments. So it either has to be get or post. So we need to connect those two things, and we'll do that in a minute. But first, let's have a look at this information here, so user data, and see if we could actually pass it in some way, some shape or form to the home page. So let's go back up to our, first of all, to this bit, which we just don't need because this is just dummy data that we were using before. So if you look at our home root here, at the moment, that was just passing that dummy data in, so I can get rid of that. Now, something we need to set up correctly is the way that we pass information from this query comments. I'm not sure what that is, so let's just get rid of that. It's just randomly there from somewhere. So from query comments, this user data, we would like to somehow use it in the home root, because it's the home root, remember, which is rendering the home.html, and it's the home root which is going to be displaying all the data in the database in those tables. So one thing we could do is we're going to have to get rid of this, of course, because we've deleted the dummy data, and this is going to be a new variable of some sort. So down here, we can, again, you can do this in many different ways, but let's do this like this. I'm going to call it something slightly different, so a variable called user underscore data now, just to make things confusing. Try and be consistent with your naming and your conventions and your identifiers, which I haven't quite been. I think we have a couple of problems with the comment. That's a good example to go back and troubleshoot and see where we went wrong, if we have gone wrong. Anyway, so user data, and what we're going to do is the result of the function query comments is going to be stored in this variable called user data. Okay, so once we have that, we can actually print the user data here, just so it would print out in the console and we could test that, but we'll do that for now. And then, of course, we have this render template, and what we're passing to the home.html now is not the reviews, but the user data. I'm just type it in like that. So user data is equal to user data. Great. Now on the home page, I could kind of randomly, I've just already stuck that there, I could type in an h1 tag or a p tag. Let's make it a p tag, it might be a bit huge otherwise. And I put in this ginger variable here with user data. Now make sure it's the same as what's being passed, otherwise it won't work. So it's user underscore data. So I'm just going to put it there underneath the button on the home page. So if I save that and I go back to my home page, you can see that the results of the database, and I've since put in a couple of different tests and things, are being stored just randomly in this massive little list or tuple on the home page. That's not what we want. We want it to be populated in this table, which is actually really, really, really simple and easy. So let's go back. Let me delete this. I'll comment it out, but I'll just get rid of it. But we know it's working, so we know that the database is returning something correctly here, and we know that all of that is working correctly. Now, one thing we need to check on is, and just add, which I've done for you here, is in your add comments.html, you'll see something which looks like this. You have your form, you have your end form, and at the beginning of your form, so in the form tag, right at the beginning of where it says, well, literally where it says form, you need to make sure that you've added the correct method and form action. So I'm literally will be writing this. I'll be writing form action. I'll be giving it a URL, which is add comments. Now this add comments, this is just the local host. This is what we are opening, what the URL that we constantly open on our server generates for us. But this add comments is referring to the root here and the actual root. So add comments. So whatever this is called, if it's called add or add comments or add comment, make sure that your add comments form action has that correct root in there. And then of course then we have the method, which is post. So in other words, we're saying that whenever someone actually enters something into this form, then that becomes a post action. And if we go back to the big questions and we look at our add comments, we're trying to say, if the request is get, well, just do nothing, just return, render this. But if it isn't, what do we want to happen? We want it to, we want it to render another template, which is, now this is interesting, see that indent is out of place, it should be there. It should be alongside there with the else, because all of this is executed along with the else, in the else statement, if that makes any sense. So we're calling that function, but we're also rendering, so we're returning render template. Think about it, we want to add the add success.html, because if the method is post and something has been successfully posted, title, name, comment, well, obviously then we want to show not the same page or something else, we want to show the add success.html page, which we haven't seen before, so we can check to see that it looks okay, if that works. So we've done that, and let's just have a look at how everything is working so far. Great, so I'm just going to save all, actually there. Might come up with a couple of errors, which will be good because we can test them. So we run. Right, so we've got our lovely site, we've got an about page, we've got home. Right, I'm going to add a comment. The title is going to be, wow, I don't know. Okay, let's just have a couple of wows for now and submit, just to see what happens. And nothing happens. It takes a while, and then it goes to this add comments. Really what it's doing is it's rendering now the add success page, because that's the page which has this notification on it. Doesn't look very nice, does it? So we could go back and go to add success, and underneath the button we could add a few little break statements. Not that it particularly matters, but you can go back and you can make this look however you wish it to look. It's taking a while to render, so that should happen once you've done that. Now that looks even worse, doesn't it? So the only bit which doesn't work now, and the last remaining bit, this is actually going to irritate me, so let's just get rid of those. is the fact that on the home button, it is not generating the contents of the database. We managed to sort of dump all the contents of the database just randomly on the page, but we haven't done it very nicely and neatly in this table. So that's what we're going to do next. So remember, on our home page, I demonstrated to you how we could just sort of randomly say underneath the button or anywhere really, you could use some ginger there and you could put in a variable such as user details. Remember, we need to refer to the variable that is being passed to the home page, which in this case, if we go to the home root, is user. Oh, it's actually user data. So be careful, it's user data, it's not user details. So that's a good thing I checked. So user data, that would just dump all the user data from the database on the page, but that's not what we want. We want it to be in the table. So let's have a look very carefully here at this table. Now this is the bit. Of course, we want the title and the name and the comments to be as it is. We don't want to replace that from the database in any way. But what we do want to replace from the database is this row. So let's just isolate it here. It's not going to create actual spaces in the HTML. So we isolate the row, and we consider that here we want the ID, here we want the title, here we would like the name, and finally here we would like the comments. And we'd not just like one bit of data from the database, we'd like all of it. So we'd have to use what's called a for loop, because we're saying for every item that is in that table, keep displaying it forever and ever for as many records as there are in this row. Repeat this row. Now, just to demonstrate that, it might be helpful for me to show you something. Actually, we can just set up the for loop and it should be fairly obvious. But in the variable that I had used, I think it was user data, if I was to use a for loop and I was isolating individual bits of data, you can, just like in an array, refer to the individual bits using index numbers such as 0, 1, or 2. So 0 would typically, in a Python-based language, refer to the first field in the database, and just keep that in mind as we create the ginger for this thing. I don't want to mess up the table there. So what we're going to type is, just get back with our little percentages sign over there. We're going to write for user in user data. I just need to keep checking that because I've used different types of variables. Yeah, user underscore data, isn't it? So user underscore data. For user in underscore data, make sure that formatting is correct. We would like, and let's end at the end of this row, let's end the for loop. So you'll get used to writing these, very simple and intuitive. And in the first row, we would like user, the value for user 0. I'm going to copy that, it's too much of a pain to keep typing these curly braces. And instead of mark, we would like 1. If it's in the right order in the database, this should populate okay. If not, you might have to manipulate those numbers a little bit. And we save it. And amazingly, you see that everything that is on the database is being replicated using a for loop. Remember, we set up in the database, we set up a primary key, which is an ID number, so that's just happening automatically. Every time you add a record, it does that, and it's working as it should. So now I'm going to go back. I'm going to just test this entire site. I wish I didn't have this information. Now, what I just said, I wish I didn't have this dummy information. Of course, another thing that we're going to have to add to the database is a delete query. So some sort of functionality which allows us to delete records from the database that we don't want. So we can come back to that in a minute. But for now, let's just test to see what's happening. So I'm going to put in a title, which is going to be attaching ourselves to the eternal. Good and true. And I put in some name, and I say meaning must have something to do with goodness, truth, and eternity. Right, so these are my thoughts at the moment on these things, and I submit. It's a little bit slow. This is the local host, and it says, "Thank you for your amazing contribution and comment." And I go back to the home page, and my record has been added to this table of amazing comments. So you can see that basically what we've done over just a couple of lessons is set up from scratch front end using Bootstrap, HTML and CSS, and a back end using Flask, SQLite, and pure SQL commands. And it should be quite intuitive for you at this point to think about how you would go about purging this database of all its values. So it's complete. So assuming you say we just wanted these two, how would we do that? So if you go back to Sublime Text and you look at all the queries, of course, all you would have to do is actually duplicate. I could create another file called db.delete, db-delete. I copy and paste all of this information, and instead of the select, I would put in a delete SQL command, which I would leave you to sort of look up and see how you could do that. Now, it is useful always to remember that you can Google, you can Stack Overflow, anything that you're not sure of. When I recently had a look at the SQL for delete on W3 Schools, I noticed that it said delete from table, but the actual command for SQLite 3 and Flask was slightly different. There was a slight difference there, and that didn't work. So it actually gives you a different command, which is truncate. Okay, so it is useful to remember that anything that you're looking for, anything that you want to do, you can just Google and get it done. So coming back to our page here, something we could think about is how we could extend this application now that we've got the basic functionality, the front end and the back end. One of the things you could do, which is really exciting and actually could do it so quickly, is add a chat room which uses some very clever functionality, sockets, etc. You could also add a login screen. So instead of users just sort of pasting their information and not being able to go back and edit their information, you could add a registration and a login screen somewhere up here. Login, sign in. A user can sign in, they can add their comment, they could also go back and they could edit their comment, etc. So lots to think about, and it's very important to try and design your website before you make it, especially from this point on. You might want to think up something, have a brilliant idea, the next Facebook, the next social media, design it, wireframe it, and then see how you could step by step start to create it using Flask. So now I want you to think of your next big idea, and it could be absolutely anything. It could be the next big social media site, it could be an e-commerce, a little shop for your mom or your grandma, it could be a fitness app, it could be anything. It could be absolutely anything. So once you think about it, you can really start to design it. And you might want to start looking into domain names. You can get them free, and similarly, you can get web space free. So web space would be for actually hosting your website online. So it's not on the local host, it's actually on a web server. What I'm going to do now, though, is give you the grand finale of the meaning of life. The meaning of life. It's a big question. In fact, it's probably the biggest of all. Through the ages, so many people have asked and really only scratched the surface or offered their own interpretations. So I too can only offer my own interpretation and my opinion. But we can break up the question into its terms, into its words. So take meaning. What does meaning mean? If we mean by meaning purpose, then most would agree that relationships, to a very large extent, define meaning. But because there's suffering in this world, there's loneliness, there's pain, because relationships are imperfect, they end. People are imperfect, life ends. The conclusion for some is that life is meaningless. Now, are they saying that for something to have purpose and ultimate meaning, it would have to be good and true, trustworthy, actually perfect, and eternal, not subject to an end? For it does seem true that a thing that ends ultimately is meaningless. The second word is life. What is it? When we think of code, program code, we immediately know as programmers that there was someone behind that code. Of course, we wouldn't for a second try to postulate that no one was behind the code, that it typed itself. Also, if we wanted to know the purpose of a website, or a language, or a framework, we would need to ask the author of that language, or the writer of a book, or the founder of a website. For Teach Yourself Python, or for teaching computing or test and track, you'd have to ask me. Now, you could interpret the purpose of a thing to the best of your knowledge, but it would just be your best guess. We do need to ask the author, to consult the documentation. Take a framework like Flask. If you saw the bits of the framework and bits of code, you wouldn't have a clue. The documentation would be key. And Python, take the language. Well, who was behind it? Van Rossum. He would be able to tell you everything that it is and what it was designed for. And then we consider the word life in the meaning of life. Now, the DNA in our cells is nothing but code, but extremely and terribly more complex, infinitely more confounding and amazing than the comparatively simple code we write to create a website. So is there someone behind this life code, behind the code that is the structure of this universe? Famous computer scientists like Konrad Zuse postulated that the world is actually a simulation, potentially a binary simulation, created. Charles Babbage, who's credited with being the inventor of the computer, spent much of his life arguing for the presence of a higher programmer, a god, in a world which was rapidly rejecting God. He argued for a designer and a doer of miracles, life itself being a miracle. So here comes the real response to the question, what is the meaning of life? We have to actually ask another question. Is there someone behind this life and the universe? If the answer is no, the gravity of accepting this answer is unimaginable. For one, in a wholly deterministic universe where there was no provision for free will, or a creator granting his creatures the dignity of causality, you could never even be sure of the question you were asking. And if there was no meaning to be found, how can we ask about meaning? So the real question seems to be, is there someone behind it all, behind the code? But consider this, if there's no designer, there's no purpose. If there's no purpose, there's no meaning. If there's no meaning, well, what's the point? Some would argue, we make the point. Each one of us can make our own morality, reality, seek our own glory, seek our own truth, make our own truth. So the first question seems to be, is there a who? Someone behind it all, someone behind the code of life, DNA, the universe, and if so, who is that who? Many would say who is equal to God. And then, can we know that God? If we can, then I can know the answer. But if I cannot, I cannot. If there is a God outside our box, the creator of it all, surely he would be too unfathomable, too great to reveal himself to a creature in this world. It would overwhelm us. If he revealed himself in all his glory, we would be forced to worship. But religions seem to be all about messengers that come into the world claiming to present a view of God. So which messenger do we believe? Is there anyone who has ever existed in history who has claimed to be perfect, good, true, unconditionally loving, providing us with a relationship that we can trust, giving their life, not taking or demanding, granting eternal life? Again, this will take a careful search through history. Every figure, every messenger, every account of every person. Is there anyone who fits this description? How can we know which message to trust? We must first know and trust the messenger. And really, we are looking for God on earth. And we're looking for that God to be good, true, eternal, and loving. But these are only my thoughts. Surely the meaning of life and the meaning of the universe is a meaning we must all find for ourselves.